Before we start, since we are dealing with a very, very complicated area, an area where many of us have already formed opinions, let me remind you of there's a principle. According to Edmund Spencer, he articulated this. There's a principle which is a bar against all information. It's proof against all argument. And it's something which cannot fail to keep man in everlasting ignorance. And that principle is condemnation before investigation. So one of our challenges as we go into this very complicated topic is to set aside our prejudices and presuppositions, and let's see what we can find out. Now,
the answer to all this and the clue to this cosmic riddle may be found in the ancient book of Genesis. And back there in chapter 6, we are told of a very amazing and bizarre event. The sons of God saw the daughters of men and saw that they were beautiful, and they lusted after them. And then we read they married them and sired children from them. For the past 1,500 years, most scholars, including evangelical scholars, have interpreted the sons of God as the good sons of Seth, and the daughters of men as the wicked daughters of Cain. They've adopted that interpretation because the other one is so bizarre and outlandish. The ancient interpretation, and in my opinion the correct one, is that the sons of God were demonic beings or fallen angels, and that they came down to earth, they lusted after the daughters of men, they married them, and produced this amazing progeny, this hybrid progeny of the Nephilim. And the very word Nephilim does not mean giants. It comes from the root Nephal, fallen ones.
Well, let's get to the real core of all of this. What's the biblical view? And we're going to talk a little bit about the days of Noah. You know, Jesus gave 4 disciples a confidential briefing on his second coming. And the 4 disciples came to him to inquire his return, and he detailed the precedent events that would occur prior to his second coming. And his answer to them, these 4 guys, is so important it's recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, in Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21 and 22. But he opens and closes that briefing with a repeated admonition. Take heed that no man deceive you. And that occurs in Matthew 24:4, and you'll find it's the theme of the entire presentation. We're dealing here in spiritual matters, and the attempt of the enemy will be to deceive us. But in the middle of this briefing, about verse 37 of Matthew 24, Jesus makes a very strange remark. He says, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, in the context there, what he may have been alluding to is simply that it'll be business as usual until, just as it was business as usual until Noah and the ark, it'll be business as usual until he returns. And most people who read that passage assume that that's all he meant. It's just that it's going to come as a surprise. And yet, there are many scholars from the context of the details of that passage feel he was giving us a hint of something deeper. And we really won't understand what he's talking about unless we understand what the days of Noah were like. Let's go on a little further in verse 9 of Genesis 6. It says, "These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God." Terrific verse. We've all read it. But most of us may not pay attention to what that's really saying. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. What does that mean? Well, the word perfect in the Hebrew is tamim. What it means is without blemish, sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired. What that verse seems to indicate is that Noah's genealogy was unblemished. Now, this comes on right after the verses that talk about these strange goings on, where these fallen angels have created some weird form of hybrid, but Noah was unblemished in his generations, and that's one of the reasons that God chose Noah and his 3 sons and their 4 wives to start over again. The purpose of the flood was not just that there was sin in the land. There was, and that's emphasized. But if sin brings the flood, we better get some life jackets. No, there's something far deeper going on. That's what I want to sensitize you for when you do your own study and come to your own conclusions. But I want you to recognize there's something much more profound that God, as a problem that God was solving, and that is that Satan's strategy was to contaminate the human race. Let's turn to 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. 2 Peter, in Peter's second letter, he says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus," it's translated hell in your English Bible, but the Greek word is Tartarus, and it's the only place that word appears in the Bible. I'll come back to that. "If God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah," and he goes on. So Peter does a couple of things here. He again alludes to the angels that sinned. They're cast into Tartarus. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And they're reserved for a final judgment. "And spared not the old world, but saved Noah." In other words, he ties that event to the days of Noah. So he not only confirms Genesis 6, but he also links it to the days of Noah. Okay. The word Tartarus deserves some comment. The problem with this word is it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, but it does appear in Greek literature. It's the Greek term for the dark abode of woe. It is the pit of darkness in the unseen world. So Tartarus was a term for a deep, special, it was regarded as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. So it's where these angels are chained until the final thing. Now, if you study classic Greek mythology, you run into the Titans. These creatures in the legends and the myths were partly terrestrial and partly celestial. They rebelled against their father Uranus, and after a prolonged contest were defeated by Zeus and condemned where? Into Tartarus. Do you see a parallel brewing here? I'm going to suggest to you that the legends of the ancient Greeks embody the truth of what really happened in the past, that there were these strange creatures generating hybrids that the Greek called Titans. And we see Zeus in many forms. We see Atlas and Hercules. Atlas and Hercules from Greek mythology were what would be called in the Hebrew Nephilim, offspring of an intermarriage between a god and a woman.
It's important for us to understand that the Nephilim were not confined before the flood. We don't know how they came about, but they were Nephilim after the flood. When Moses sends in the 12 tribes, in Numbers 13, verse 33, they encountered the Nephilim in the land. Who built the pyramids? That's yet another ancillary question here. Who built the pyramids? The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Stonehenge in Britain, and the Circle of the Rephaim in the Golan. And they're up in the Golan Heights. There's an unexplored monument we discovered up there that is called the Gilgal Rephaim. Who are the Rephaim? And the Circle of Rephaim is 5 circles, 20-ton stones, about 155 meters in diameter, dated to about 3000 B.C. It's built on a flat plateau. And by the way, you can only detect its architecture from above, strangely, and so forth. There's some others, too, that are, if you fly over that area, you see the hints of others. These have never been explored. And the point I want to get across, it startled me to realize that this is not simply a study in Old Testament ancient history. It is essential to understand, if you're going to understand your Bible, understand prophecy. You need to understand there were Nephilim after the flood. In Genesis 4, it says there were Nephilim in those days, and also after that. It even hints at it right there. In Genesis 14 and 15, we discover there are 4 tribes at least, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Hurim, and the Zamzummim, that Joshua was instructed to wipe out every man, woman, and child. Boy, that sounds like genocide. It was, because we had the same thing, not a flood this time, it was a local situation. And Arba, Anak, and his 7 sons, the Anakim, are talked about not just in the Bible, but also in Egypt, by the way. They were encountered in Canaan, Numbers 13:33, when the 12 spies went. When they came back, Joshua and Caleb had the good report. The other 10 guys said, hey, there's Nephilim in the land. That's the word they used. They were giants. We are like grasshoppers in their sight. That's not an exaggeration. They had reason to be terrified. Obviously, Joshua and Caleb had faith in God. We're, God's on our side, let's go. But and it's easy to disparage the other 10 guys. You need to understand they had, on the one hand, some reason to be cautious. In Deuteronomy 3 and Joshua 12, we encounter Og, the king of Bashan. He's the king of the giants, the Rephaim. Goliath, remember, he had 4 brothers. That's why David picked up 5 stones when he crossed the brook. Why? He was ready for all 5 of those guys.